In the dense, mist-choked Ardennes, a fractured squad of American soldiers was being pursued through the trees. Lieutenant James Jack Holloway knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and being tracked like wounded prey. What had begun as a reconnaissance mission had turned into a brutal game of survival, with German hunters closing in. A quiet autumn morning turned deadly when Hauptmann Erik Drexler's elite tracking unit picked up their trail. These weren't ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. They were the kind who had hunted partisans through the frozen woods of the Eastern Front, the kind who never left survivors. Lieutenant James Holloway wasn't just another lost officer. For 6 years, he had served as an OSS field operative, trained in sabotage, ambush tactics, and unconventional warfare. He had infiltrated enemy lines before, dismantled supply chains, and left entire squads of Germans dead in their sleep. When Drexler's men moved in for the kill, they had no idea they were stepping into a battlefield of Holloway's design. The Americans weren't running anymore. Holloway and his men laid their final trap, a sequence of explosive surprises and lethal choke points that would turn the hunters into the hunted. What began as a desperate retreat would become a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. The Ardennes would never forget the day a handful of stranded Americans turned the forest itself against the Germans who pursued them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist drifted between the trees like ghostly fingers, obscuring their path and muffling sound. For Lieutenant James Jack Holloway, this was both blessing and curse. The fog concealed their movements but also disoriented them, making navigation through the dense Ardennes forest a nightmare. "How's he doing?" Holloway whispered, crouching beside Fit Arthur Kowalski. The wounded man's face was ashen, a sheen of sweat glistening despite the autumn chill. Sergeant Frank O'Reilly shook his head grimly as he finished tightening the blood-soaked bandage around Kowalski's thigh. "Not good, Lieutenant. Bullet's still in there. I've seen enough mining accidents to know when a man's bleeding inside." O'Reilly's hands, steady as they were with explosives, seemed almost gentle now. "He needs a real medic, not my spit and polish." Art tried to smile, but it turned into a grimace. "Just give me a stick to bite on, O'Reilly. I'll make it." His stubborn loyalty was intact, even as blood seeped through fresh bandages. Holloway nodded, suppressing the wave of guilt that threatened to drown him. 3 days ago, they'd been a 12-man reconnaissance unit. Now they were 5, scattered and hunted after walking straight into a German ambush. An ambush he should have seen coming. "Lou, anything?" Holloway called softly to their youngest member. Private Louis Becker hunched over the portable radio, his boyish face scrunched in concentration. The son of German immigrants, he'd enlisted partly to prove his American loyalty, and his eagerness made the current failure even more bitter. "Nothing, sir, just static." Lou adjusted the frequency again, desperation evident in every movement. "I think the ridge is blocking the signal. If we could get higher." "No," Holloway cut him off. "Higher ground means exposure. We stay in the trees." From a few yards away, Corporal Theo Dutch van Rensburg materialized from the mist like a specter. The former Dutch resistance fighter moved without sound, a skill honed through 2 years of guerrilla warfare before joining the Allies. "They're following our trail," Dutch reported, his accent still thick despite years of English. 8, maybe 10 men. Elite hunters, not just regular Wehrmacht. His eyes, dark and haunted, held Holloway's gaze. "They have dogs." Holloway absorbed this news silently, calculating distances and options that dwindled by the minute. "How far?" 2 kilometers, maybe less, moving carefully. They know we're wounded." Dutch glanced at Kowalski. "We're leaving blood on the ground." O'Reilly cursed under his breath. "So we're dead men walking. That's just grand." "We're not dead yet," Holloway replied, his mind racing through scenarios. Each option seemed worse than the last. They couldn't outrun their pursuers, not with Kowalski slowing them down. They couldn't hide, not from trained trackers with dogs. Lou looked up from his radio, youthful face pale in the dim forest light. "Sir, if I could just get a signal out." The 101st is supposed to be 20 miles north of here. If they knew. Keep trying, Holloway ordered, though he doubted help would come. The forest suddenly felt vast and indifferent, a silent witness to their plight. The distant crack of a twig, too deliberate to be natural, sent a chill through the group. Time to move, Holloway decided, helping O'Reilly lift Kowalski. The wounded man bit back a cry of pain. They pressed deeper into the forest, 5 men against the wilderness and a ruthless enemy. The Germans were no longer just behind them. They were all around, closing in from multiple directions. Holloway could feel it, like a noose tightening. Hauptmann Erik Drexler studied the dried blood on the fallen log with clinical detachment. His gloved fingers touched the dark stain, testing its tackiness. Less than 2 hours old, he announced to his hunting party. One of them is wounded, severely, judging by the volume. His men nodded, faces impassive. They were the best trackers the Wehrmacht could offer. Veterans of the Eastern Front, where they'd hunted partisans through forest far more vast and unforgiving than the Ardennes. The blood trail leads northwest, reported Unteroffizier Müller, the dog handler. His German shepherd strained at its leash, eager for the hunt. Drexler studied the crude map in his hands. They're trying to reach Allied lines, he mused. But they're running out of options. He traced a finger along the contours. The ridge will force them to either climb or swing east. Or stand and fight, suggested Feldwebel Kraus, his scarred face betraying nothing. Drexler smiled thinly. That would be sporting of them. Sir, they're just 5 men, 1 wounded, another soldier pointed out. Why not simply radio ahead for reinforcements to cut them off? Drexler's pale eyes hardened. Because this isn't merely about capture, Lieutenant Weber. It's about understanding the enemy. These men penetrated 10 miles behind our lines before we detected them. I want to know how they think, how they move. He folded the map deliberately. Besides, the radio frequencies are compromised. For all we know, they're listening now. He wasn't wrong. In the dense undergrowth 1/2 kilometer ahead, Lou had finally captured a faint German transmission. Though his German was rudimentary, he understood enough to relay their peril to Holloway. They know about Art's wound, Lou whispered. They're tracking us by the blood. Holloway's mind raced. They needed a new strategy. Fast. O'Reilly, ever practical, was the first to speak what they all feared. We can't outrun them. Not with Art. Art himself, propped against a massive oak, locked eyes with Holloway. Leave me, I'll buy you time. No one's leaving anyone, Holloway snapped harder than he intended. 5 months ago, he'd lost 5 men in a botched operation in Italy. Never again. We stay together. We survive together. Dutch, who had been silently scanning the forest, suddenly spoke. What if we stop running? 4 pairs of eyes turned to him. Explain, Holloway demanded. Dutch's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. In Holland, when the Germans hunted us, sometimes the best tactic was to hunt them back. His eyes glinted with remembered violence. This forest, it can fight for us. O'Reilly nodded, slowly, understanding dawning. Traps. I could rig some nasty surprises with what we've got. The former miner's hands twitched, eager for purpose. Holloway considered the idea, weighing their limited options. The image of Drexler and his men, confidently pursuing what they thought was helpless prey, crystallized his decision. We're done running, he declared, voice steady despite the enormity of the choice. From this moment, we turn this forest into our battlefield. O'Reilly, what do you need? The sergeant's eyes lit up with grim purpose. Wire, explosives, some time. He patted his pack. I've got enough to make things interesting. Lou looked uncertain. Is this allowed, under the rules of war? Dutch's laugh was bitter. Ask the Germans about rules when they're burning your village. Holloway placed a hand on Lou's shoulder. We do what we need to survive. All of us. He glanced at Art, whose breathing had grown, labored. Time was running out. O'Reilly, start rigging the approaches. Dutch, find us a defensive position where Art can rest. Lou, keep monitoring their transmissions. Holloway felt a strange calm settle over him as the plan took shape. They think they're hunting us. Let's show them what it's like to be the prey. As night fell over the Ardennes, the real battle was just beginning. In the growing darkness, O'Reilly's calloused hands carefully stretched tripwire across a narrow game trail, while Dutch melted into the shadows to select the perfect sniper's nest. The Germans would come, confident in their superior numbers and training. But the forest would be waiting for them, and so would Holloway's men. In the pale pre-dawn light, O'Reilly's breath formed small clouds as he worked. His fingers, numbed by the autumn chill, carefully twisted thin wire around a tree trunk at ankle height. "Not like that," Dutch whispered, materializing beside him. "Too obvious, a trained man will spot it." O'Reilly bristled. "I know what I'm doing. Been rigging explosives since before you were shooting Nazis." Dutch knelt and gently adjusted the wire, concealing it with fallen leaves. "In the resistance we learned the hard way. Germans are not stupid." O'Reilly shifted his attention to a deadfall trap 20 yards ahead. "This one's meant to maim, not kill," he explained, gesturing to sharpened branches suspended above the path. "They trigger the tripwire, these come down. Their screams will draw others. There's a secondary charge here for whoever comes to help." Dutch's expression darkened. "You want to wound first so you can kill more?" "It's called efficiency." "It's called cruelty," Dutch countered. "We are soldiers, not butchers." O'Reilly laughed bitterly. "Tell that to the Germans." "I've seen what happens when we become like them," Dutch said quietly. "In my village, when the Gestapo couldn't find resistance fighters, they gathered civilians, made examples." His eyes were distant. "There is a line, Sergeant. Cross it, and we are no better than Drexler." O'Reilly's hands stilled momentarily, before continuing his work. "So what would you have me do? Invite them to tea? We've got one gun for every 2 Krauts out there, a wounded man who's not getting better, and a radio that might as well be a paperweight." "Make it clean," Dutch said. "A trap should kill quickly or not at all." "War isn't clean." "No, but men can still choose what kind of monsters they become." Their argument was interrupted by Holloway's approach. The lieutenant moved silently, having shed his boots for cloth-wrapped feet that left minimal tracks. "Report," he ordered quietly. O'Reilly straightened. "Perimeter's nearly secure. Tripwires on the 3 most likely approaches. 2 deadfalls, 3 mines." Holloway nodded, noting the tension between the men. "Good. And the false trail?" "Laid it myself," Dutch replied. "Signs of a panicked retreat northeast. Blood trails from Art's bandages. But any skilled tracker will know it's too obvious." "That's the point," Holloway said. "They'll think we're trying to mislead them poorly, which will make them more likely to follow our actual false trail." He permitted himself a grim smile. "Sometimes the best trap is the one they think they're too smart to fall for." "And if they're smarter than we give them credit for?" O'Reilly asked. "Then we'll find out soon enough. Come on, Lou's picked up something on the radio." Back at their makeshift camp, a depression beneath a massive fallen oak, Lou hunched over the radio. Art lay nearby, shivering despite the jackets draped over him. The wound in his thigh had developed an angry red streak climbing toward his torso. "They're using a simple cipher," Lou explained. "They're coordinating search patterns. They know we're still here." Holloway knelt beside him. "Can you transmit on their frequency?" Lou hesitated. "Yes, but they'll know it's not one of theirs." "I don't need you to impersonate them," Holloway said. "I need you to misdirect them." Understanding dawned on Lou's face, followed by uncertainty. "You want me to send false information?" "Sir, if they capture me, they'll shoot you whether you're transmitting or not," O'Reilly said bluntly. Dutch gave him a warning look before addressing Lou more gently. "In war, deception is a weapon like any other. But if you cannot do this, we find another way." Lou swallowed hard. "I can do it. What do you want me to send?" Before Holloway could answer, Art thrashed suddenly, mumbling incoherently, His eyes flew open, wild with fever. "They're coming," he shouted. "The tanks! Get down! Get down!" O'Reilly lunged to cover Art's mouth. "Jesus Christ, he's delirious. The whole damn forest will hear him." Art fought with surprising strength. "Hughes, Dawson, on your left, they're flanking us!" Holloway moved quickly, pressing a water canteen to Art's lips. "Easy, soldier. You're safe. We're here." Art's eyes gradually focused. "Lieutenant? Was I shouting again?" "Just a little." Holloway lied, exchanging worried glances with the others. The fever meant infection had taken hold. Another day, maybe two, before sepsis would claim him. When Art had drifted back to uneasy sleep, Holloway gathered the others several feet away. "We need to accelerate the timetable," he said softly. "Art doesn't have long and his fever's making him a liability. Lou, transmit in 30 minutes. Make them think we're heading for the ridge to establish radio contact." Lou nodded, his young face set with new resolve. "O'Reilly, Dutch, finish the outer ring of traps. Focus on the western approach." "One more thing," Holloway added, his voice dropping even lower. If his condition compromises us again." The implication hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "I'll handle it," O'Reilly volunteered, his voice gruff but resolute. Dutch's eyes flashed. "There are limits, Holloway." "Are there? Out here, with what's at stake?" Holloway looked each man in the eye. "I pray we won't face that choice, but if we do, remember, one life against 4 isn't a choice at all." Half a kilometer away, Hauptmann Drexler sat against a tree trunk, cleaning his Luger while listening to reports. "The blood trail leads northeast, Herr Hauptmann," reported Müller. "But it seems deliberate." "Of course it's deliberate," Drexler replied without looking up. "They want us to follow it." Feldwebel Kraus frowned. "So we ignore it?" "No, we follow it, cautiously." Drexler reassembled his Luger. "These men are not fools. Their commander has realized they cannot outrun us, so now they play a different game." "Sir," Lieutenant Weber interrupted, approaching with the radio operator. "We've intercepted an American transmission. They're heading for the ridge to establish contact with their lines." Drexler studied the map thoughtfully. "The ridge would give them better radio range, but it also exposes them. This is also bait." He tapped the map. "They want us to commit forces to the ridge while they slip away elsewhere." "Then what do we do?" asked Kraus. "We divide. Weber, take 4 men and sweep towards the ridge, but carefully. Müller, you and the dogs continue following the blood trail. I will take 2 men and circle west." He checked his watch. "Report every hour. If you encounter resistance, do not engage alone. These men are desperate, which makes them dangerous." As his hunting party dispersed, Drexler felt a curious respect growing for his unseen opponent. The hunt had become interesting. At midday, Lou completed his 3rd false transmission. "Do you think they believe it?" he asked anxiously. "Doesn't matter if they believe it," Holloway replied. "Only that they consider it enough to split their forces." Dutch returned from reconnaissance. "They've taken the bait. 4 men heading toward the ridge. 3 following the false blood trail northeast. Drexler and 2 more have disappeared." "He's circling," Holloway concluded. "Probably to the west." "Good. That puts him on a collision course with our heaviest defenses." Art's voice, weak but lucid, startled them. "Let me be useful. Put me somewhere as bait. I'm dead anyway. Might as well take some Germans with me." "Not happening," Holloway said firmly. Art's feverish eyes found Holloway's. "We both know what's coming, Lieutenant. Don't waste an asset out of sentiment." Before Holloway could respond, a distant noise stopped all conversation, the unmistakable metallic click of a tripwire being triggered. 3 seconds passed in absolute silence. Then the forest erupted. The explosion was deafening, magnified by the dense trees. Birds scattered from branches as the shockwave rolled through the forest, carrying the scent of cordite and blood. Dutch was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. O'Reilly looked grimly satisfied. Western approach, he confirmed. That'll be my welcome package. 12-foot kill radius packed with scrap metal. Lou looked pale. How many were there? How many did we just... We'll soon find out. Holloway cut in, already moving. Dutch with me. O'Reilly, protect Lou and Art. 200 yards from their camp, the forest floor told the story. What had once been 2 German soldiers was now a grotesque tableau of torn uniforms and scattered remains. Dutch surveyed the scene with cold professionalism, but his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. This was Drexler's forward patrol, Holloway whispered, examining insignia on a torn scrap of uniform. But where's Drexler himself? The answer came as a single gunshot echoed from the direction of their camp. O'Reilly had just finished checking Art's bandages when he heard it, a twig snapping to their east. He reached for his rifle, signaling Lou to get down. I know you're there, American, came a cultured voice with a German accent. Your traps are impressive, but ultimately futile. O'Reilly froze. Somehow Drexler had circled completely around them, opposite the direction they'd expected. Your wounded man requires medical attention, yeah? Drexler continued. Surrender now and I give you my word he will receive proper treatment. Lou looked to O'Reilly, panic in his eyes. Art gripped O'Reilly's sleeve and shook his head emphatically. You have my word, Art whispered hoarsely. If you surrender, I'll haunt your ass for eternity. O'Reilly's weathered face cracked into a grim smile. He raised his voice. Why don't you come a little closer so we can discuss terms? He called, subtly shifting to place himself between the voice and his comrades. I think not, Sergeant. Drexler replied with amusement. How did the German know his rank? I have learned to respect your squad's creativity. O'Reilly's mind raced. Drexler was stalling, probably positioning his remaining men. Lou, O'Reilly whispered urgently. There's a secondary trigger behind that fallen log. When I start shooting, you hit it. Lou nodded, determined despite his fear. One last chance, Americans, Drexler called. I would prefer not to add to the casualty count, yours or mine. O'Reilly took a deep breath. Well, since you put it that way. He suddenly swung his rifle toward Drexler's voice and fired 3 rapid shots. Go! Lou lunged for the hidden detonator as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. O'Reilly dove for cover, returning fire. Lou reached the detonator and pulled hard. Nothing happened. It's jammed, he cried, frantically working the mechanism. A German bullet splintered bark inches from Lou's head. O'Reilly cursed and shifted fire to protect him. Art, despite his condition, had managed to drag himself behind a log, service pistol clutched, in trembling hands. The crisp crack of a rifle shot from behind them momentarily confused O'Reilly, until a German soldier fell from a nearby tree. Then another precision shot dropped a second German. Dutch had arrived. Holloway appeared at O'Reilly's side, firing controlled bursts from his Thompson. Status? Drexler found us, O'Reilly reported between shots. Secondary charges failed. Holloway nodded grimly. Dutch is on the high ground. Cover our withdrawal. He grabbed Lou's shoulder. Grab the radio. We're falling back to position Bravo. Lou hesitated. What about Art? A stray bullet kicked up dirt between them. I'll get Art, O'Reilly volunteered, already moving. Just keep those krauts off my back. Holloway directed covering fire as O'Reilly reached Art, only to find him unconscious, blood seeping from a fresh wound in his shoulder. A German bullet had found him during the chaos. Damn it, Art, O'Reilly muttered, hoisting the limp form across his shoulders. You just can't catch a break. As the squad executed their withdrawal, Dutch's precision fire kept the Germans' heads down. But they'd been outmaneuvered this time. Drexler had proven himself a worthy adversary, avoiding their most elaborate traps and nearly catching them, unprepared. The first round had gone to the Americans with the tripwire trap. The second round, unquestionably, belonged to Hauptmann Drexler. From his position 50 yards away, Drexler watched the Americans disappear into the forest. He could have pressed the attack, but 2 more of his men were dead, and the American sharpshooter had proven exceptionally dangerous. "Sir, shall we pursue?" asked Feldwebel Kraus, the only other survivor of their initial team. Drexler reloaded, his Luger thoughtfully. "No, radio the others. Tell them to converge on this position." "But the Americans are escaping." Drexler's thin smile held no warmth. "Are they? Or are they leading us exactly where they want us to go?" He gestured to the abandoned campsite. "This is merely the opening gambit, Feldwebel. Our opponent is clever, but now I understand his methods." The hunt would continue. But Drexler would no longer underestimate his prey. They weren't just running. They were transforming the forest into a battlefield of their own design. And that made them infinitely more dangerous. A red dawn broke over the Ardennes, painting the treetops crimson. The morning mist, thick and clinging, transformed the forest into a ghostly realm where shadows moved like specters. In this ethereal landscape, Hauptmann Drexler knelt beside what remained of his men. He ran gloved fingers over the edge of the blast crater, noting the distinctive signature of the explosion. Not military grade, he decided. Improvised, but expertly crafted. He stood, brushing soil from his knees, and surveyed the killing ground with dispassionate eyes. "Booby traps here and likely here," he informed Feldwebel Kraus, indicating locations with precise gestures. "They're using the natural funnels in the terrain, making us choose between obvious paths and hidden dangers." Kraus, his weathered face impassive, nodded. "The men are growing cautious, Herr Hauptmann. These Americans, they're not fighting like regular soldiers." "No," Drexler agreed, a hint of respect coloring his tone. "They've adapted, as must we." He turned as Lieutenant Weber approached with the reunited hunting party, now reduced to 8 men. New protocol: 2 scouts forward at all times, 5-meter spacing between men. No one touches anything without inspection first. Weber saluted, crisply. "And our objective, sir?" Drexler's pale eyes scanned the forest. Somewhere out there his prey was watching, waiting, planning their next move. "Unchanged, Lieutenant, but we will be more methodical." With a small knife, Drexler carved something into the bark of a nearby oak. When he stepped back, the message was clear. "You can't win." He smiled thinly. "Now, we hunt." 2 kilometers. Northwest, Holloway's squad had established a new position in a rocky outcropping that provided both cover and elevated sightlines. Dutch, having scouted the surrounding terrain before dawn, had identified multiple approach routes they could monitor and defend. O'Reilly, operating on minimal sleep, was setting the last of their charges around the perimeter. His explosive supply had dwindled dangerously low, forcing him to create smaller, more targeted traps. "How many more can you make?" Holloway asked, quietly, helping to disguise a pressure plate beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. O'Reilly grimaced. 3, maybe 4 if I get creative with the firing mechanisms. After that, he shrugged. "We're down to rifles and prayers." Holloway nodded, absorbing this information with outward calm. Inwardly, he was calculating, always calculating. Time, distance, ammunition, odds of survival. None of the equations balanced in their favor. Lou approached, his young face haggard from constant radio monitoring. "No response from HQ, Lieutenant. Either they can't hear us or they're not looking for us," Holloway finished. The unspoken reality hung between them. Their original mission had been classified, unsanctioned by regular command. If they disappeared, no official rescue would be mounted. They were ghosts already. From his makeshift bed of pine boughs, Art watched through fever-glazed eyes. His wounded leg had swollen grotesquely, the infection spreading visibly hour by hour. The second wound in his shoulder, though less severe, had further weakened him. Each labored breath seemed more difficult than the last. "How is he?" Holloway asked Dutch, who had been checking Art's bandages. The Dutchman's expression was grim. "The infection is in his blood now, without medicine." He left the sentence unfinished. Art, more lucid than they expected, laughed weakly. "Don't sugarcoat it, Dutch. I'm circling the drain." His voice, once robust, had thinned to a rasp. "Leave me, I'm just slowing you down." "Not happening," Holloway replied automatically, though the tactical part of his brain, the cold, calculating part that had kept him alive through North Africa and Italy, acknowledged the truth in Art's words. Dutch touched Holloway's arm, drawing him several paces away. "He has hours, Jack, not days." "I know. Every minute we spend carrying him is—" "I said I know," Holloway snapped, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, just, let me think." Dutch nodded, understanding in his eyes. The weight of command was never heavier than when it involved deciding who lived and who died. The quiet conversation was interrupted by O'Reilly's urgent whisper. "Movement. 3 o'clock. 200 yards." All eyes turned to the indicated direction. Through gaps in the mist, shadowy figures advanced cautiously through the trees. Germans, moving in pairs, widely spaced. "They've adapted," Dutch observed, respect and concern mingling in his voice. "Drexler's no fool." Holloway made a swift decision. "Hold position. Let them pass." They weren't ready yet, still setting their defenses. Better to wait until all pieces were in place. The squad froze, barely breathing, as the German patrol moved parallel to their position. One pair of soldiers passed within 50 yards of their hideout, close enough that Holloway could see the sweat on their faces, the wary alertness in their eyes. Then disaster struck. From his sickbed, Art erupted into a violent coughing fit. Despite O'Reilly's attempt to muffle the sound with a jacket, the noise carried in the still morning air. The Germans froze. One raised his hand, signaling to others out of sight. Slowly, deliberately, a young soldier, barely older than Lou, began advancing toward the rocky outcropping, rifle at the ready. Holloway's eyes met Dutch's. A silent communication passed between them. Dutch's hand moved to his knife, quieter than a gun. Holloway nodded once. Dutch slipped away, vanishing into the underbrush with uncanny silence. Holloway and O'Reilly stayed motionless, weapons ready if Dutch's interception failed. Lou, crouched beside the radio, held his breath, eyes wide with tension. The young German soldier advanced cautiously, sweeping his weapon in a disciplined arc. His face, unlined and freshly shaved, carried a mixture of fear and determination. He wasn't a seasoned killer like some of Drexler's men, just a boy following orders. He was less than 20 feet from discovering their position when Dutch struck. The Dutchman emerged from nowhere, one hand clamping over the German's mouth. From behind, the other driving his combat knife deep into the base of the skull. The soldier's eyes widened in shock, a muffled sound escaping as his body went rigid, then limp. Dutch lowered him to the ground with practiced efficiency, wiping, his blade clean on the dead man's uniform. It was over in seconds. Clean, quiet, and utterly ruthless. Dutch dragged the body into the brush as Holloway watched for the soldier's partner. The second German, noticing his comrade's disappearance, began to approach warily. "O'Reilly," Holloway whispered. "We need that one alive. Information." O'Reilly nodded grimly, setting aside his rifle and readying a garrote. As the second German neared, following his missing comrade's trail, Holloway deliberately snapped a twig. The German's head whipped toward the sound, exactly as Holloway intended. In that moment of distraction, O'Reilly lunged from concealment. But unlike Dutch's textbook execution, O'Reilly's attack was messy. The German managed to cry out before the garrote cut off his air. He struggled violently, landing an elbow in O'Reilly's ribs that sent both men crashing into the underbrush. Lou, witnessing his first close-quarters killing, stood frozen in horror. The German's eyes bulged as he fought for air, fingers clawing desperately at the wire cutting into his throat. O'Reilly's face was a mask of strain and determination, the veins in his forearms standing out like cords as he maintained pressure. After an eternity compressed into seconds, the German went still. O'Reilly released the garrote, breathing heavily. "Sorry, Lieutenant. Got sloppy." Holloway was already scanning the forest. "Did anyone hear?" As if in answer, A distant German voice called out, questioning. When no response came, a different voice barked orders, the sound of men spreading out, advancing with purpose. "They know," Dutch said unnecessarily, materializing beside them. Holloway's mind raced. "Lou, O'Reilly, grab Art and fall back to the secondary position. Dutch with me will delay them." Lou stared at the dead German, his young face pale. I've never seen someone die like that before." "And now you have," O'Reilly said roughly, yanking him toward Art. "Move." As Lou and O'Reilly lifted Art between them, Holloway and Dutch positioned themselves on opposite sides of the likely approach. Holloway checked his Thompson, half a magazine left. Ammunition, like everything else, was running critically low. "They'll come from multiple directions," Dutch warned, settling into a sniper's position. "Drexler knows our tactics now." "Just buy them enough time to get clear," Holloway replied. "Then we follow." Dutch's hand suddenly gripped Holloway's arm. The Dutchman's eyes, normally so controlled, held a haunted intensity. "Holloway, Jack. If they capture us, they won't just kill us. Not after what we've done to their men." Holloway understood. The rules of war had limits. They'd crossed into territory where different rules applied. "Save your last bullet," he suggested grimly. Dutch nodded. "For ourselves." The first Germans appeared 3 minutes later, advancing in a disciplined skirmish line. Dutch's rifle cracked, and the point man dropped. Holloway waited until more targets presented themselves, then opened fire in controlled bursts, dropping 2 more before shifting position. The Germans responded with concentrated fire, bullets chewing bark from trees and ricocheting off rocks around their position. Holloway and Dutch maintained a steady retreat, firing and moving, creating the impression of a larger force. When they'd bought enough time, they disengaged, sprinting through the forest toward the rendezvous point. Behind them, German shouts indicated the discovery of their abandoned position and the bodies of their comrades. Lou and O'Reilly had made it halfway to the secondary position when Art's condition deteriorated drastically. His breathing became labored and his skin took on an ashen hue. "Put me down," he gasped between breaths. "Can't go on." "Shut up and save your strength," O'Reilly growled. But even he could see that Art was failing rapidly. They eased him down behind a fallen tree. Lou, still shaken from witnessing the German's death, fumbled with a canteen. "Here, Art." "Small. Sips." Art pushed it away weakly. "Listen to me," he rasped. "I'm not going to make it. You know it. I know it." His eyes, bright with fever, held surprising clarity. "Leave me a weapon. I'll buy you time." "No," Lou protested immediately. "The lieutenant said we stick together." "The lieutenant..." Art coughed, blood flecking his lips. "The lieutenant's a good man. Too good. Makes him blind sometimes." He grabbed O'Reilly's wrist with surprising strength. "Tell me I'm wrong, Frank. Tell me I'm not just dead weight now." O'Reilly's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes, usually so hard, softened almost imperceptibly. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, Art." Art smiled weakly. "Always have been." He turned to Lou. "Kid, this is war. People die. The point is to make sure the right people live." Lou shook his head, tears threatening. "We're not leaving you." The distant sound of gunfire punctuated their conversation. Holloway and Dutch were engaging the enemy, buying them time they were wasting. O'Reilly made his decision. "Lou, scout ahead to the secondary position, make sure it's secure." "But that's an order. Go." Lou looked between them, understanding dawning. No, Lieutenant," Holloway said. "Go," O'Reilly barked with such authority that Lou flinched. "Now, that's a direct order, Private." Lou hesitated a moment longer, then turned and moved reluctantly into the forest, glancing back repeatedly until trees obscured his view. When he was gone, O'Reilly knelt beside Art. "What do you need?" Art closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "My sidearm grenades if you can spare them." O'Reilly nodded, placing Art's pistol in his hand along with 2 grenades. precious resources they couldn't afford to lose, yet couldn't afford to deny him. "Position me facing that approach," Art instructed, indicating the direction from which the Germans would likely come. "Behind that boulder. Good field of fire." O'Reilly helped him into position, propping him up so he could see and shoot. Art's breaths came in shallow gasps now, each one a struggle. "Tell my wife." Art began, then stopped, reconsidering. "No, don't tell her anything. What would be the point?" O'Reilly, awkward in the face of emotion, squeezed Art's shoulder. "I'll make sure she knows you died a hero." Art laughed weakly. "We both know that's bullshit. No heroes in this war, Frank, just survivors and corpses." He checked his pistol with practiced movements, though his hands trembled. "I'll hold them as long as I can. Go." "Art. Go, damn it. Don't make this for nothing." O'Reilly hesitated, then nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement of sacrifice. Without another word, he turned and followed Lou's path. Art Kowalski, alone now, positioned himself as comfortably as his ruined body allowed. The fever burned through him, pain a distant sensation overwhelmed by the certainty of what was coming. He thought briefly of home. A small apartment in Chicago, his wife's smile, the children they'd never have now. Then he pushed those thoughts away. There was only the mission now. Only the next few minutes that might make a difference. He checked his weapon one final time and settled in to wait. When Holloway and Dutch reached the rendezvous point, they found O'Reilly and Lou already there. Art was conspicuously absent. "Where is he?" Holloway demanded, though he already suspected the answer. O'Reilly met his gaze steadily. "He couldn't make it. He chose to stay behind." "You left him?" Holloway's voice was dangerously quiet. "It was his decision, Lieutenant," O'Reilly replied, unflinching. "He knew he was dying. Wanted to make it count." "I gave an order." Holloway advanced on O'Reilly, fury rising. "No one gets left behind." Dutch stepped between them. "Jack, Art was gone already. You know this." "That wasn't your call to make, Sergeant," Holloway said, his anger barely contained. "No, it was mine," came a quiet voice. Lou stepped forward, face pale but determined. "Art told me to go ahead. He knew what he was doing." The lie was transparent, but Lou's willingness to share the burden of decision spoke volumes. Holloway looked between his men, the fight draining out of him. They all knew the truth, even if none would speak it. Art was a liability they couldn't afford. A distant rattle of gunfire interrupted the moment. Several shots, then silence. "That's Art," O'Reilly said softly, "selling his life dearly." Holloway closed his eyes briefly, honoring his man's sacrifice. When he opened them, his face was set with renewed determination. "We move out in 5 minutes. Head north toward the river. If we can cross it, we might shake Drexler." Dutch, who had been scanning their surroundings with practiced vigilance, suddenly tensed. "Holloway." The one lieutenant followed his gaze. Carved fresh into a tree trunk 20 yards away was a message: "You can't win." Drexler had been here, recently. "He's hurting us," Dutch said quietly, "like animals." Holloway studied the carving, mind racing through implications. Drexler was proving more cunning than anticipated, anticipating their moves, leaving psychological breadcrumbs to unsettle them. "New plan," he decided. "We don't run from Drexler anymore." His eyes hardened with resolve. "We hunt him instead." The transformation was complete, from prey to predator in the space of a carved message. But as they gathered their meager supplies and prepared to turn the tables on their pursuer, each man silently acknowledged the cost of this evolution. Art's sacrifice. The German boys they'd killed up close. The pieces of their humanity surrendered to necessity. This was the blood price of survival, and they'd only just begun to pay it. They made camp in the hollow of a massive oak. Art Kowalski lay propped against his pack, shivering despite the jackets draped over him. The infection in his leg wound had worsened, angry red streaks now climbing toward his groin. His skin burned with fever while his lips had taken on a bluish tinge. Dutch studied him with impassive eyes. He won't last the night. The infection is in his blood. Holloway nodded, grimly. He'd watched men die from wound fever before, always the same progression. Fever, delirium, unconsciousness, death. What about antibiotics? Lou asked, digging through their meager medical supplies. Used the last of the sulfa powder yesterday, O'Reilly replied, cleaning his rifle. Besides, he'd need a proper medic at this point. Lou's face fell. So we just watch him die? We keep moving, Holloway decided. First light tomorrow. The Krauts will run us down in 3 hours if we keep dragging him along, O'Reilly said quietly. We're not leaving him, Holloway stated firmly, though a part of him recognized the brutal logic. None of them noticed Art watching them, more lucid than they realized. Dawn came cold and hazy. Holloway woke first and checked on Art, finding him awake and surprisingly alert. Morning, Lieutenant, Art whispered, voice hoarse but steady. Got any coffee? Art's skin remained feverish, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in days. A temporary rally, a final burst of clarity before the end. I'll get you some, Holloway promised, signaling to Lou, who was stoking the tiny fire. Art gripped Holloway's wrist. Need to talk to you, alone. Holloway hesitated, then nodded, helping Art into a sitting position and moving them slightly, away from the others. I know what you're all thinking, Art began. And you're right. Art? No, let me finish. I'm dying. We all know it, and I'm slowing you down. He gave a weak approximation of his smile. Not exactly a winning combination. Holloway felt something tight constrict his chest. We'll get you out. Art shook his head. No, you won't. And that's okay. He paused. But I'll be damned if I die being carried like a sack of potatoes while those Nazi bastards hunt us down. What are you saying? Art's eyes hardened with resolve. I'm saying I want to choose how I go out. Understanding dawned. Holloway searched Art's face for any sign of delirium, finding only clear-eyed determination. You've thought about this, Holloway said. Not a question. Since yesterday. Art nodded toward the supplies. The M1 40 rounds, 2 grenades. That's all I need. And you think I'll just let you sacrifice yourself? Holloway kept his voice neutral. Art's laugh dissolved into a cough. With respect, Lieutenant, it's not your choice to make. I'm already dead. The only question is whether I die uselessly in my sleep or take some Germans with me. He leaned closer. Give me this, Jack. Let me make it count. Holloway closed his eyes briefly. He and Art had served together since North Africa. Now Art was asking for permission to die on his own terms. The others won't accept it, Holloway said finally. O'Reilly will. Dutch too. They understand. Art's eyes flicked toward Lou. The kid's the only wild card. He'll blame me. Then let him. Better he hates you and lives than loves you and dies. Art gripped Holloway's arm. I've made my peace, Lieutenant. Have you? Before Holloway could answer, O'Reilly approached with coffee. Made a decision, have you? He asked Art directly. Art nodded. Just need the lieutenant's blessing. O'Reilly glanced between them. He's right, you know, from a tactical perspective. I know, Holloway admitted quietly. And from a human one, too, O'Reilly added. A man deserves to choose his ending. Holloway took a long sip of coffee. When he finally met Art's eyes again, he nodded once. A soldier's acknowledgement. Art's face relaxed slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me for signing your death warrant, Holloway replied, voice rough. Art smiled faintly. Not for that. For respecting my choice. Dutch accepted the plan without comment. Years in the resistance had taught him the cold equations of survival. Lou was a different matter entirely. No, he protested, face flushed. We can't just leave him to die. It's my choice, kid, Art said gently. Not yours, not the lieutenant's. But we can carry you, we've been managing so far. Art shook his head. Every hour you spend carrying me reduces your chances. I'm already on borrowed time. He gestured to his infected leg. This is going to kill me. The only question is whether I let it take all of you down with me. Lou turned desperate eyes to Holloway. Lieutenant, please, there has to be another way. There isn't, Holloway said quietly. I wish there was. So we just abandon him? What happened to no man left behind? O'Reilly stepped forward. Sometimes, kid, the bravest thing isn't dying together. It's letting someone make their stand so others can live. Lou shook his head mutely, tears threatening. Hey, Art called softly. Come here, Lou. The young radio man approached reluctantly, kneeling beside Art. I need a favor, Art said, his voice steady despite the pain. That picture in my left pocket, my wife. When you get back, tell her I wasn't afraid. He pressed something small and metal into Lou's palm. And give her this. Lou looked down at Art's wedding ring, his fingers closing around it. I will, he promised, voice thick. I swear. Good man. Art's eyes moved to include them all. Now help me up. I've got a date with some Germans to keep. They gave him everything he could carry. The M1 Garand, ammunition, 2 grenades, a canteen of water, and morphine for when the pain became unbearable. Art refused the morphine. Need a clear head, he explained. Save it for someone who has a future to worry about. Holloway drew him aside for a final word. You sure about this? Art nodded. Never been more sure of anything. What's your plan? Head east about a mile, that ridge we passed yesterday. Good fields of fire. Only one real approach. I'll set up there. Art's eyes gleamed. Should be able to hold them long enough for you to put some distance between us. Holloway clasped his hand. It's been an honor serving with you, Art. Likewise, Lieutenant. Art added, do me one favor. Name it. Win this damn war. Make all this matter. Holloway nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Art turned to the others. O'Reilly gave him a gruff nod. Dutch clasped his forearm in a warrior's grip. Lou hung back, still struggling. Lou, Art called. No hard feelings, kid. Someone's got to make it home and tell the stories. He grinned, a flash of his old self breaking through the pain. Make me sound heroic, will you? 6 foot tall, at least and twice as handsome. A reluctant smile tugged at Lou's lips. I will. With that, Art Kowalski hefted his rifle, winked at his comrades, and limped into the forest alone. They watched until he disappeared among the trees, a solitary figure moving with determined purpose, despite his grievous wound. Finally, Holloway shouldered his pack. Southwest, he ordered quietly. We move fast and quiet. Make his sacrifice count. They marched in silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Lou kept glancing back the way they had come. O'Reilly focused grimly on the path ahead. Dutch scouted the route with his characteristic efficiency, though his eyes seemed haunted. Holloway led them, the burden of command never heavier. Had he made the right choice? Or had he simply allowed a dying man to sacrifice himself so Holloway wouldn't have to make the hard call? They had covered perhaps 2 miles when the distant crack of rifle fire shattered the forest silence. 5 shots, in rapid succession, followed by a pause, then 3 more. Art, O'Reilly said unnecessarily. They all stopped, listening intently. More shots followed, sporadic now, interspersed with the distinctive chatter of German MP-40s. The firefight continued for several minutes, then a hollow boom echoed through the trees, a grenade detonating, then silence, complete, absolute silence. Lou looked at Holloway, his young face pale. Should we? No, Holloway said firmly, though every instinct screamed at him to go back. We stick to the plan. Art bought us time. We use it. He could still be alive, Lou protested half-heartedly. He made his choice, Dutch said quietly. Honor it by surviving. They resumed their march, the mood even more somber. An hour later, they heard distant vehicular movement. German transport. Lou's face darkened with anger. If we'd stayed together, maybe we could have. We'd all be dead, O'Reilly interrupted bluntly. Against vehicles and reinforcements, no chance. At least we'd have died together, Lou muttered. Holloway stopped abruptly. Is that what you think Art wanted? For us all to die in some glorious last stand? His voice was tight. He gave his life so we could live, Lou. Don't cheapen that by wishing it was worthless. Lou flinched, then his shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, Lieutenant, it's just... I know, Holloway said, his tone softening. We all feel it. Hauptmann Erik Drexler knelt beside the body of Private Arthur Kowalski. The man had died well, positioned on a rocky outcrop with excellent fields of fire. He had killed 3 German soldiers and wounded 2 more before succumbing to his wounds. The empty rifle lay beside him, along with a spent grenade shell. He was already dying, observed the German medic. Severe infection. Wouldn't have lasted another day. Drexler nodded thoughtfully. Yet he chose to make a stand rather than slow his comrades. He rose. A tactical decision, but also a matter of honor. Sir? The medic looked confused. He sacrificed himself to save his unit, Drexler explained. Most men cling to life until the bitter end, begging their comrades to drag them along. This one chose a soldier's death instead. Have the men bring him, Drexler ordered suddenly. Carefully. Bring him, Herr Hauptmann. Yes, Drexler confirmed, his pale eyes gleaming. Our American friends should see what their comrade's sacrifice has purchased them. The medic hesitated. You want to display the body? Not display, Drexler corrected sharply. Honor, a soldier's message to soldiers. His thin lips curved. And perhaps a reminder of what awaits them all. As his men carefully lifted Kowalski's body, Drexler surveyed the scene of the Americans' last stand with newfound respect. The man had positioned himself perfectly, using natural cover to maximum advantage. He had rationed his ammunition carefully, making each shot count. Most impressively, he had maintained his position despite his wounds and fever, a testament to extraordinary willpower. These Americans were proving to be more formidable than Drexler had initially assumed. Not just fleeing prey, but skilled adversaries worthy of professional respect. The hunt had become interesting. They made camp as dusk fell, finding shelter in a shallow cave. Dutch built a small smokeless fire while O'Reilly set up a perimeter of early warning devices. Lou had barely spoken since their earlier exchange, focusing mechanically on his tasks. As they huddled around the tiny fire, sharing the last of their K-rations, Dutch suddenly tensed. Someone's coming, he whispered, reaching for his rifle. Northeast, moving slowly. They doused the fire immediately, each man taking position. Holloway and Dutch covered the cave entrance while O'Reilly and Lou guarded their flanks. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, from the darkness outside, came a sound that froze their blood, something heavy being dragged across fallen leaves. Hold fire, Holloway ordered in a barely audible whisper. Wait for visual confirmation. The dragging sound stopped just beyond the cave entrance. Then a German voice called out from the darkness. A gift for you, Lieutenant Holloway. Courtesy of Hauptmann Drexler. Something was pushed into the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Then footsteps retreated rapidly. Dutch was the first to move, approaching cautiously. When he saw what it was, his normally impassive face contorted with rage. God damn them, he snarled, his accent thickening with emotion. Holloway joined, him, his heart sinking. Art Kowalski's body lay before them, carefully arranged to appear as if peacefully sleeping. His wounds had been cleaned, his uniform straightened. On his chest lay his dog tags and a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Holloway unfolded the note. Written in elegant script was a simple message. He died a soldier's death. Will you? Lou pushed forward, a strangled sound escaping. his throat. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." O'Reilly placed a hand on the young radio man's shoulder, his own face tight with fury. "This is psychological warfare," he said flatly. "Don't let it work." But it was working. Holloway could see it in Lou's devastated expression, in Dutch's cold rage, in O'Reilly's trembling hands. Drexler had transformed Art's noble sacrifice into a weapon against them. "We bury him," Holloway decided, his voice steadying. "Properly. With respect." "We don't have time," O'Reilly objected. "The Germans could be watching." "We bury him," Holloway repeated, with the quiet authority that made men follow him into battle. "If Drexler wants to use that against us, so be it. But we don't leave him like this." They worked in silence, digging a shallow grave with entrenching tools, laying Art's body to rest. Lou placed the wedding ring back on Art's finger, tears streaking his face. "He should go home with this," Lou explained simply. "To her." Holloway nodded, understanding. Some promises transcended duty. When it was done, they stood around the grave in the moonlight, 4 men bound by shared grief and determination. No words were spoken. What could be said? Art Kowalski had given everything for them. As they gathered their equipment to move out, Lou approached Holloway, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what I said earlier. You were right." Holloway clasped his shoulder. "We're all struggling with this, Lou. No apology needed." Lou shook his head. "No, I need to say it. Art chose. He knew what he was doing." His face hardened with newfound resolve. "And I want Drexler to pay for what he did, for using Art like that." "He will," Holloway promised, a cold certainty settling in his gut. "We'll make sure of it." They moved out under cover of darkness, 4 men now instead of 5, each carrying a piece of Art Kowalski with them, his courage, his sacrifice, his final lesson in the brutal arithmetic of war. Death was no longer an abstraction, no longer a distant possibility. It had walked among them, claimed one of their own, and left the survivors changed forever. But as they vanished into the darkness of the Ardennes forest, something else moved with them. A determination forged in grief and tempered by rage. Drexler had sought to break their spirit with his macabre gift. Instead, he had crystallized their resolve. The Germans had hunted them through the forest, unaware they were setting a trap. Now the hunt would truly begin. 20 hours after Art's sacrifice, they found the ravine. It stretched like a scar through the Ardennes, a natural funnel 30 feet deep with steep walls and a narrow passage at its base. The perfect killing ground. Holloway studied its contours with calculating eyes. Raw grief over Art had hardened into cold resolve, transforming him. Gone was the cautious lieutenant. In his place stood a hunter mapping his territory. "This is it," he announced, voice low as they crouched at the ravine's edge. "O'Reilly, can you work with this?" The explosives expert surveyed the terrain with professional appreciation. "Oh, I can work with this, Lieutenant. I can make these walls come down like the wrath of God." "How much time do you need?" O'Reilly mentally inventoried his remaining supplies. 2 hours, maybe 3. "You have 1, Holloway decided. "Dutch, find high ground. I want eyes on all approaches." Dutch nodded, already scanning the ridgeline for the optimal position. "What about Drexler's scouts? They'll be watching." "Let them watch," Holloway said. "I want them to see us." A hint of a smile crossed Dutch's weathered face. Understanding dawned. "Bait." "Exactly." Holloway turned to Lou, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Art's death. "Lou, I need you on the radio. Monitor all German frequencies. If they're planning a move, I want to know." Lou nodded, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "What if it's a trap? What if Drexler expects this?" "He does," Holloway confirmed. "But expecting a trap and avoiding it are different things. He'll come because he has to. Because we've killed his men, because we've evaded him, because we've challenged him. His eyes gleamed with dangerous intensity. Pride is a powerful lure. O'Reilly grinned wolfishly. And a deadly weakness. They dispersed to their tasks. O'Reilly began planting explosives at strategic points along the ravine walls, calculating precisely where charges needed to be placed to bring down the maximum amount of rock and earth. His fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as he worked. Art's absence weighed on him more than he'd admit. Dutch moved like a shadow through the forest, finding an elevated position that gave him sight lines to all likely approaches. He settled into the crook of a massive oak, rifle nestled against his shoulder, and began his patient vigil. Lou tuned the radio with practiced precision, cycling through frequencies, listening for German transmissions. His young face had lost its innocence over the past days, hardened by Art's death, by the close-quarters killing he'd witnessed, by the brutal education of survival. Holloway moved between them, coordinating their efforts, his mind constantly recalculating possibilities. The plan itself was simple: make their presence obvious enough to draw Drexler in, but not so obvious as to telegraph the trap. Let the German officer believe he was springing his own carefully orchestrated ambush when, in reality, he was walking into theirs. It was a gamble, but after Art's death, gambling with their lives seemed a small price for vengeance. Hauptmann Erik Drexler stood motionless in the forest, listening. Not to sounds, though the woods were alive with them, but to instinct. 20 years of military service had honed his intuition to a razor's edge, and every instinct told him something had changed. "They're no longer retreating," he observed to Feldwebel Kraus, the only remaining member of his original hunting party. "They've chosen to fight." Kraus, a veteran of the Eastern Front, nodded grimly. "The wounded one. You think he's dead?" "Yes, and that has freed them, made them dangerous in a new way." Drexler studied the map where his scouts had marked recent Allied movements. "They're heading for the ravine. Setting a trap," Kraus concluded. "Obviously." Drexler's pale eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "But they know we'll recognize it as such." "A double bluff, Herr Hauptmann?" "Perhaps." Drexler traced the contours of the map with gloved fingers. "Or perhaps they simply have nowhere else to go." Their discussion was interrupted by Lieutenant Weber's arrival. The young officer approached with measured steps, his previous eagerness tempered by the harsh lessons of the hunt. "Sir, scout reports confirm. The Americans are at the ravine. 3 men visible. The explosives expert appears to be setting charges." Drexler frowned. "They're making no attempt to hide their intentions?" "None, sir. In fact—" Weber hesitated. "Speak, Lieutenant." "It seems they want us to see them. The red-haired one, the sergeant, he's placing his charges in plain sight." A faint smile crossed Drexler's face. "How thoughtful of him to show us where not to step." He folded the map decisively. "They expect us to approach through the ravine where their explosives will bury us alive." "So we avoid the ravine entirely?" Weber suggested. "No." Drexler's eyes glinted with cold calculation. It stretched like a scar through the Ardennes, a natural funnel 30 feet deep with steep walls and a narrow passage at its base. The perfect killing ground. Holloway studied its contours with calculating eyes. Raw grief over Art had hardened into cold resolve, transforming him. Gone was the cautious lieutenant. In his place stood a hunter mapping his territory. "This is it," he announced, voice low as they crouched at the ravine's edge. "O'Reilly, can you work with this?" The explosives expert surveyed the terrain with professional appreciation. "Oh, I can work with this, Lieutenant. I can make these walls come down like the wrath of God." "How much time do you need?" O'Reilly mentally inventoried his remaining supplies. 2 hours, maybe 3. "You have 1, Holloway decided. "Dutch, find high ground. I want eyes on all approaches." Dutch nodded, already scanning the ridgeline for the optimal position. "What about Drexler's scouts? They'll be watching." "Let them watch," Holloway said. "I want them to see us." A hint of a smile crossed Dutch's weathered face. Understanding dawned. Bait. Exactly. Holloway turned to Lou, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Art's death. Lou, I need you on the radio. Monitor all German frequencies. If they're planning a move, I want to know. Lou nodded, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. What if it's a trap? What if Drexler expects this? He does, Holloway confirmed. But expecting a trap and avoiding it are different things. He'll come because he has to, because we've killed his men, because we've evaded him, because we've challenged him. His eyes gleamed with dangerous intensity. Pride is a powerful lure. O'Reilly grinned wolfishly. And a deadly weakness. They dispersed to their tasks. O'Reilly began planting explosives at strategic points along the ravine walls, calculating precisely where charges needed to be placed to bring down the maximum amount of rock and earth. His fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as he worked. Art's absence weighed on him more than he'd admit. Dutch moved like a shadow through the forest, finding an elevated position that gave him sight lines to all likely approaches. He settled into the crook of a massive oak, rifle nestled against his shoulder, and began his patient vigil. Lou tuned the radio with practiced precision, cycling through frequencies, listening for German transmissions. His young face had lost its innocence over the past days, hardened by Art's death, by the close-quarters killing he'd witnessed, by the brutal education of survival. Holloway moved between them, coordinating their efforts, his mind constantly recalculating possibilities. The plan itself was simple: make their presence obvious enough to draw Drexler in, but not so obvious as to telegraph the trap. Let the German officer believe he was springing his own carefully orchestrated ambush when, in reality, he was walking into theirs. It was a gamble, but after Art's death, gambling with their lives seemed a small price for vengeance. Hauptmann Erik Drexler stood motionless in the forest, listening. Not to sounds, though the woods were alive with them, but to instinct. 20 years of military service had honed his intuition to a razor's edge, and every instinct told him something had changed. They're no longer retreating, he observed to Feldwebel Kraus, the only remaining member of his original hunting party. They've chosen to fight. Kraus, a veteran of the Eastern Front, nodded grimly. The wounded one. You think he's dead? Yes, and that has freed them, made them dangerous in a new way. Drexler studied the map where his scouts had marked recent Allied movements. They're heading for the ravine. Setting a trap, Kraus concluded. Obviously. Drexler's pale eyes narrowed thoughtfully. But they know we'll recognize it as such. A double bluff, Herr Hauptmann? Perhaps. Drexler traced the contours of the map with gloved fingers. Or perhaps they simply have nowhere else to go. Their discussion was interrupted by Lieutenant Weber's arrival. The young officer approached with measured steps, his previous eagerness tempered by the harsh lessons of the hunt. Sir, scout reports confirm. The Americans are at the ravine. 3 men visible. The explosives expert appears to be setting charges. Drexler frowned. They're making no attempt to hide their intentions? None, sir. In fact, Weber hesitated. Speak, Lieutenant. It seems they want us to see them. The red-haired one, the sergeant, he's placing his charges in plain sight. A faint smile crossed Drexler's face. How thoughtful of him to show us where not to step. He folded the map decisively. They expect us to approach through the ravine where their explosives will bury us alive. So we avoid the ravine entirely? Weber suggested. No. Drexler's eyes glinted with cold calculation. Dutch continued firing from his elevated position, his precision shots forcing the flanking Germans to seek cover. Using the smoke as concealment, Holloway and Lou half-carried O'Reilly toward the primary charge. They had seconds, maybe less, before they were completely surrounded. O'Reilly pulled the backup detonator from his pocket, a simple contraption that would instantly trigger the main charge when connected. His hands, slick with blood, fumbled with the wires. Steady, Holloway urged, keeping watch through gaps. In the smoke. The Germans were closing in, shadowy figures moving with disciplined purpose through the white haze. "Got it," O'Reilly whispered triumphantly as the wires connected. "Now we run, fast." They had barely taken 3 steps when the world exploded around them. The main charge triggered perfectly, setting off a chain reaction through the smaller explosives. The ravine walls shuddered, then collapsed in a thunderous cascade of rock and soil. Men screamed as the earth gave way beneath them. Dust billowed upward in a choking cloud, momentarily turning day to night. But O'Reilly's delay in triggering the explosives had cost them their clean escape. They were still dangerously close to the collapse, and Drexler's flanking force was between them and their planned extraction route. "Change of plans," Holloway shouted over the continuing rumble of falling rock. "Southwest, move," Dutch provided, covering fire from his perch as they half ran, half stumbled through the forest. O'Reilly's wound left a trail of blood, but there was no helping that now. Speed was their only ally. Behind them, the dust began to settle over the ravine. Now, a jumbled mass of rock and broken trees. How many Germans had been caught in the collapse was impossible to tell, but the anguished cries suggested the toll had been significant. Yet even as they fled, Holloway knew their victory was incomplete. Drexler was too smart to have been caught in such an obvious trap. The German officer would be among the survivors, and now he would be driven by more than professional duty. They had wounded his pride, killed his men, and escaped his carefully laid counter-trap. The hunt had become personal. Hauptmann Drexler brushed rock dust from his uniform with methodical precision. Around him, the survivors of his force regrouped, tending to the wounded, counting their losses. 6 men dead in the ravine collapse, 2 more from the sharpshooter on the ridge. "We underestimated them again," Lieutenant Weber observed quietly, wincing as a medic bandaged his arm. "No," Drexler corrected, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "I understood their capability perfectly. I simply failed to anticipate their desperation." He surveyed the devastation with clinical detachment, and their leader's resourcefulness. "They're heading southwest," reported a scout, pointing to the blood trail leading away from the ambush site. "The explosives expert is wounded," Drexler nodded. Southwest meant deeper into German-held territory. A counterintuitive choice that confirmed his growing respect for Lieutenant Holloway's tactical acumen. "Your orders, Herr Hauptmann?" Weber asked. Drexler's pale eyes narrowed, calculating. "We continue the pursuit, but now we match their desperation with precision." He turned to his remaining men, voice hardening. "No more underestimation, no more clever games. From this moment we hunt to kill." He checked his Luger with practiced efficiency, then led his reduced force into the forest. The blood trail beckoned like a promise. The Americans had won this round, turning his own trap against him. But the hunt was far from over, and Hauptmann Erik Drexler had never failed to catch his prey. 2 kilometers southwest, Holloway's squad paused in a dense thicket to tend O'Reilly's wound. The bullet had passed clean through his thigh, missing bone and major arteries, lucky considering. Dutch bound it tightly with a field dressing, his movements efficient despite his exhaustion. "How bad?" O'Reilly asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live," Dutch replied. "But running is finished for now." O'Reilly cursed softly. "I'm slowing you down just like Art." Holloway cut him off sharply. "That's not happening again. We stay together." Lou, monitoring the radio, looked up suddenly. German transmissions. Their continuing pursuit, switching to a new frequency. He adjusted the dial, listening intently. "They sound angry." "We hurt them," Holloway observed. "Badly from the sound of it." "Not badly enough," Dutch countered, checking his rifle's remaining ammunition. 4 rounds. Dangerously low. "And we've lost our explosive advantage." Holloway nodded grimly. O'Reilly's remaining charges had been used in the ravine ambush. They were down to small arms now, against a numerically superior force with better supply lines and local knowledge. "So what's the play, Lieutenant?" O'Reilly asked, wincing as he tested his bandaged leg. Holloway studied their surroundings, mind working through dwindling options. They'd reversed the hunt momentarily, but at significant cost. Drexler would be more cautious now, more ruthless, and they were running out of tricks. We keep moving, he decided finally. Find defensible ground. Make Drexler come to us on our terms. And if we can't? Lou asked quietly, voicing the fear they all felt. Holloway's expression hardened, memories of Art's sacrifice fresh in his mind. Then we make sure the price of catching us is higher than Drexler's willing to pay. As they gathered their meager supplies and prepared to move out, Holloway felt a strange calm settle over him. They were no longer running from Drexler. They were drawing him in, deeper into a game where the rules changed with every move. The hunt had reversed again. But this time, neither side was fully predator nor prey. They were adversaries locked in a deadly chess match where the forest itself was the board, and survival the only prize worth winning. Night fell over the Ardennes like a shroud, plunging the forest into darkness, a blessing for Holloway's squad as they withdrew. O'Reilly leaned heavily on Dutch, his wounded leg turning each step into agony. "We need to stop," Dutch whispered, as O'Reilly stumbled again. "He's losing blood." Holloway scanned their surroundings before pointing to a hollow beneath a fallen oak. "Lou, check it for sight lines." Lou crept forward. Good coverage on 3 sides. Single approach from the north. They settled O'Reilly against the trunk, his face ashen in the faint light of Lou's shielded flashlight. Dutch changed the field dressing with practiced efficiency. "How's it look?" O'Reilly asked, voice tight with pain. "Clean through and through, no major vessels hit, but infection is a risk." O'Reilly nodded grimly. They all knew what infection meant. The same fate that had claimed Art. "I'll keep moving," he insisted. "Just need rest." Holloway turned to Lou. "Radio check. Anything from Allied frequencies?" Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lou adjusted the dials. "Nothing useful, sir. Some encrypted transmissions, but too faint to decode." "And the German frequencies?" Lou's expression shifted, oddly quiet. "A few transmissions, but they're too clear. Almost like they want us to hear them." Holloway absorbed this with unease. Drexler was evolving his tactics into psychological territory. "Don't engage," Holloway decided. "Listen only. They're trying to draw us out." As if summoned, a distant crack echoed through the forest, a branch breaking underfoot, too deliberate to be natural. Then another, closer, and another from a different direction. Dutch's rifle came up instantly. O'Reilly reached for his sidearm, pain temporarily forgotten. They waited as the sounds continued, always moving, always circling, never approaching directly. After 20 minutes, the forest fell silent. "A message," Dutch murmured. "They know approximately where we are, but not precisely. And they want us to know they know," Holloway added. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. "Achtung, amerikanische Soldaten," came a cultured voice, Drexler himself. "Your position is compromised. We have you surrounded. Your explosives expert is wounded and slowing you down. Your ammunition is nearly exhausted." Lou frantically shook Holloway awake as Drexler continued. "I offer you honorable surrender, medical attention for your wounded man, proper treatment as prisoners of war. Consider your position carefully. You have until sunrise to decide." The transmission ended abruptly. "How does he know about our ammo situation?" Lou whispered. "He's guessing," Holloway replied. "It's a logical assumption after days of fighting." Dutch had returned during the transmission. "He's not surrounding us yet. I've checked the approaches." O'Reilly nodded agreement. "Classic psychological warfare. Make us think we're trapped when we still have options." Holloway considered their situation with brutal honesty. O'Reilly's wound made rapid movement impossible. Their ammunition was critically low. Dutch had 4 rifle rounds. Holloway half a magazine for his Thompson. O'Reilly perhaps a dozen pistol rounds. and Lou his sidearm with a single clip. We don't surrender, Holloway decided. We change the game again. He outlined his plan quickly. Rather than flee, they would set a final trap to force Drexler to commit his entire force. We give him what he wants, Holloway explained. A clear target, but on our terms. O'Reilly nodded, professional interest overcoming his pain. I've got one package of explosives left. Saved it for an emergency. He smiled thinly. This qualifies. As sunrise painted the eastern sky, they prepared to move. Lou coordinated a false radio transmission, suggesting they were requesting extraction at coordinates 3 kilometers north. When Drexler's radio operator intercepted the message, Weber immediately said, "It's a trick." Obviously, Drexler agreed. But why this particular trick? He traced the coordinates on his map, a small clearing perfect for helicopter extraction or an ambush. The wounded sergeant, he said suddenly. He'd never make it 3 kilometers north in his condition. Understanding dawned. A deliberate misdirection. They're broadcasting false coordinates while moving in a different direction entirely. South? Suggested Krauss. No, Drexler replied, a hint of admiration coloring his tone. East, toward our lines. The last direction we'd expect. The terrain is less challenging, and there's a road 5 kilometers east. He made his decision quickly. Weber, take 4 men and investigate the clearing. Approach with caution, it may be trapped. Krauss, you're with me. We move east immediately. They've split their forces, Dutch reported, returning from his scouting position. 4 men heading north toward the false coordinates. The rest, including Drexler, moving east. Holloway nodded with satisfaction. Their plan was working, partially. Drexler had proven his acumen by guessing their direction. He thinks we're making for the Clairvaux Road, Holloway explained. He's assuming O'Reilly's wound is dictating our route. So where are we actually going? Lou asked. Southwest, Holloway replied. There's a ravine system with only one viable crossing point. Dutch's eyes gleamed with understanding. The bridge at Derenberg. Exactly. The squad that was supposed to rendezvous with us planted demolition charges on that bridge 2 days ago. They never got to use them, but the charges are still there. O'Reilly's professional interest overcame his discomfort. How do you know? They haven't been discovered. I don't, Holloway admitted, but it's our best option. The plan was audacious. They would move southwest, paralleling Drexler's eastward movement until he realized his error. By then, they would be positioned at the bridge, where O'Reilly would integrate his remaining explosives with the pre-existing charges. When Drexler tracked them there, they would spring their trap, collapsing the bridge with the Germans on it. It's a long shot, Dutch observed. Everything about the last 3 days has been a long shot, Holloway replied. One more won't hurt. They moved, out carefully, Dutch supporting O'Reilly. The sergeant's condition had stabilized, but he remained weak, his face gray with suppressed pain. By midday, Lou suddenly stiffened, pressing his headphones tighter. Lieutenant, he whispered urgently. German transmission. Drexler's realized. His mistake. They're changing direction. Holloway nodded grimly. Time estimate. They're calling in the other group as well. Based on their coordinates, 3 hours, maybe 4 before they could reach us. Then we have 3 hours to reach the bridge and prepare our welcome, Holloway decided. By mid-afternoon, they caught their first glimpse of the ravine. Narrower than the first one, but deeper, with walls dropping 30 meters to a rocky stream. There, Dutch pointed southeast. A wooden structure spanned the ravine, the Derenberg Bridge, a simple crossing built for forestry work, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. As they approached, Holloway assessed the structure. The bridge was approximately 20 meters long, supported by wooden trestles anchored to the ravine walls. O'Reilly, what do you think? O'Reilly surveyed the bridge with professional interest. Depends on where the previous charges were placed. Done right, we could bring it down with minimal additional explosives. Dutch was already examining the structure. Here, he called after several minutes, indicating the main support beams. And here. He pointed to similar locations on the opposite side. O'Reilly nodded approvingly. Textbook placement. Whoever set these knew their business. Can you work with them? Holloway pressed. With what I've got left? Absolutely. O'Reilly's eyes gleamed. I'll need to cross first, check the integrity of the existing charges, then integrate my package with their detonator system. On the far side, O'Reilly immediately began examining the existing charges, blocks of military-grade explosive attached to the main support beams, connected to a detonator box hidden beneath a false rock. Beautiful work, he murmured. These are still active, wiring's intact. Detonator needs a battery, but I've got one that'll fit. He glanced up at Holloway. Give me 40 minutes. I'll have a nasty surprise waiting for our German friends. Lou monitored the radio with increasing tension. They're moving faster than we anticipated. Something's changed. They sound urgent. Holloway assessed the implications. They've called for reinforcements. Drexler wants to complete his hunt before they arrive. Or save his pride, Dutch suggested. He's lost too many men to return empty-handed. How long? Holloway asked Lou. Based on their coordinates, less than 2 hours. They're pushing, hard. Holloway nodded grimly. Then we accelerate our timetable. As Dutch and Lou established defensive positions, Holloway returned to check on O'Reilly's progress. The explosives expert had opened the detonator box and was connecting his remaining package to the existing network. How's it coming? Holloway asked. Almost done, O'Reilly replied. Beautiful system they left us. He connected 2 final wires, then closed the control box. There. One press of this remote trigger, and the whole structure comes down. He handed Holloway a small device with a single red button protected by a safety cover. 400-meter range. Clear line of sight needed for guaranteed detonation. Holloway pocketed the trigger, then helped O'Reilly to his feet. Let's get you to cover. O'Reilly shook his head stubbornly. Not yet, there's one more thing we could do. A refinement. What kind of refinement? A faint smile crossed O'Reilly's pain-lined face. The kind that would make Art proud. As dusk approached, Drexler's hunting party emerged from the forest east of the bridge. They moved with purpose, following the clear trail Holloway had. Deliberately left broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, even a discarded field dressing marked with O'Reilly's blood. It's too obvious, Weber cautioned. Another trap. Of course it's a trap, Drexler agreed calmly. The question is not whether, but where and how. He studied the approaching ravine through his binoculars. The bridge, that's where they'll make their stand. Despite his composure, Drexler felt growing urgency. Headquarters had informed him that a full infantry company was being dispatched, due to arrive by morning. His private hunt would soon become a conventional military operation, unless he completed it first. Scout the bridge approach, he ordered. Kraus. Carefully. Check for tripwires, pressure plates, anything suspicious. As Kraus disappeared into the underbrush, Drexler considered his options. The Americans had proven themselves masters of improvised warfare. The bridge represented a perfect ambush point, a bottleneck where his numerical advantage would be neutralized. Yet he had to cross it. The ravine stretched for kilometers, too steep to descend and climb efficiently, and time was running short. Kraus returned 10 minutes later, his weathered face troubled. No obvious traps, Herr Hauptmann. The bridge appears intact, but feels wrong. Too easy. Drexler nodded thoughtfully. After days of ingenious ambushes, would Holloway suddenly leave such an obvious crossing undefended? Unless the trap was the obvious nature of the trap itself. They want us to avoid the bridge, Drexler realized suddenly. To waste time searching for an alternative crossing. He made his decision. We cross the bridge. Standard formation, 5-meter spacing. I'll go first. From their concealed position, Holloway watched Drexler's approach through field glasses. The German officer moved with characteristic precision, testing each board before committing his weight. He suspects something, Dutch observed quietly. But he's still crossing, Holloway replied. That's all that matters. Their revised plan, O'Reilly's refinement, was elegant in its psychological manipulation. The bridge was indeed rigged to explode, but not all at once. O'Reilly had modified the charges to collapse in sequence, beginning from the far side after the Germans were fully committed. The explosion would trap them on a disintegrating structure, with nowhere to go but down. They're spreading out, Lou reported, 5-meter spacing between men. O'Reilly, propped against a tree trunk and looking alarmingly pale, clutched a secondary detonator in his trembling hand. This would trigger the first charge, initiating the sequence. Remember, he warned, voice weak but professional, there's a 3-second delay between charges. Time your movements accordingly. Drexler's reached the midpoint, Dutch reported, calmly. 3 more men on the bridge behind him. Holloway felt time slow as he watched the Germans advance. Drexler had reached the 3/4 mark, his men following at carefully measured intervals. 1 more minute and they'd be perfectly positioned. Then everything changed. From the far side of the ravine, a sharp crack split the air. A branch, breaking under careless weight. Drexler froze instantly, his hand rising in a signal for his men to halt. What was that? Lou whispered urgently. On the bridge, the German officer dropped to one knee, scanning the forest on both sides of the ravine. His body language transformed from cautious advance to predatory awareness. He knows, Dutch whispered. Not where, but that we're watching. Drexler made a sharp gesture and his men began a careful withdrawal. Their opportunity was evaporating. Now, Holloway ordered sharply. O'Reilly, detonate. O'Reilly's thumb pressed down on the trigger, without hesitation. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder, the first charge exploded at the far end of the bridge. The entire structure bucked violently, sending 2 German soldiers tumbling over the edge. Drexler maintained his footing through sheer determination, but found his retreat cut off as the bridge began to disintegrate behind him. 3 seconds later, the second charge detonated midway along the span. Support beams cracked and splintered, the wooden deck twisting unnaturally. Move, Holloway commanded, breaking cover to provide suppressing fire as Dutch and Lou began their withdrawal. O'Reilly struggled to his feet, refusing Lou's offered support. I can manage, he insisted, staggering after them. Go! On the collapsing bridge, Drexler showed why he was considered an elite officer. Despite the destruction surrounding him, he maintained enough composure to draw his Luger and return fire, forcing Holloway to duck behind a tree trunk as bullets splintered bark near his head. The third charge detonated with a deep, resonant boom. The bridge's remaining supports groaned in protest as the structure began its final collapse. Drexler, recognizing his imminent fate, locked eyes with Holloway across the intervening space. In that moment, something passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement of worthy adversaries. Then the bridge gave way completely, plunging Drexler and his remaining men into the depths of the ravine. Move out, Holloway ordered, providing covering fire as his squad retreated into the forest. Dutch helped O'Reilly, while Lou stayed close, radio clutched to his chest. Behind them, dust billowed from the ravine, punctuated by the crash of falling debris. The bridge was gone, and with it their pursuers. Yet as they melted back into the protective embrace of the Ardennes, Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. Drexler had survived too much, adapted too well to be eliminated by a simple fall. The hunt might not be over, but the advantage had shifted decisively in their favor. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over the Ardennes. A fine mist clung to the forest floor, transforming the landscape into something otherworldly. Holloway's squad had made camp in a dense thicket 2 kilometers from the collapsed bridge, confident they'd bought themselves a reprieve. O'Reilly's condition had stabilized overnight. The blood loss had stopped, and Dutch's careful field medicine had cleaned the wound as thoroughly as possible. Still, the strain showed in O'Reilly's ashen face. Another day and we might reach friendly lines, Holloway observed, studying their crude map. If we push northwest from here, we could intercept the 101st's positions. Lou, who had been monitoring, The radio through the night suddenly looked up with an alarmed expression. "Lieutenant," he whispered. "German transmissions. Close. Very close." "How close?" "Signal strength suggests less than half a kilometer." "Impossible," O'Reilly muttered. "We saw Drexler go down with the bridge." Holloway shook his head slowly. "He survived." "Pack up," Holloway ordered. "We move in 5 minutes." As they gathered their supplies, Lou continued monitoring the transmissions. "Lieutenant, they know exactly where we are. They're coordinating a surround and capture operation." "Someone's been watching us," Dutch concluded. "Probably all night." "Move. Now," Holloway ordered sharply, but it was already too late. As Lou rose, a single shot cracked through the morning stillness. The bullet struck the ground inches from his feet, a warning. "Down!" Holloway shouted, drawing his Thompson. The second shot shattered Lou's radio, sending fragments flying. The young radio man fell backward, unhurt but stunned. "Hold your fire," came a familiar voice, cultured, controlled. "Drexler." "You're surrounded, Lieutenant Holloway," Drexler continued. "My compliments on the bridge trap. Most ingenious, but as you can see, I'm more resilient than you anticipated." "How many men do you have left, Drexler?" Holloway called back. "Can't be many after that fall." A soft laugh floated through the mist. "Enough for what I need. Though I must say you've given my superiors quite a headache with your exploits. An entire hunting party decimated by 4 men." While Drexler talked, Holloway caught Dutch's eye and made a subtle hand gesture. "Circle back, locate the threat." Dutch nodded almost imperceptibly and began to inch backward. "What do you want, Drexler?" Holloway called, deliberately keeping the German officer engaged. "I'm offering you a chance to surrender, honorably as soldiers. My word that you'll be treated according to the conventions of war." "Like you treated the resistance fighters in Holland?" Dutch growled, loud enough for Drexler to hear. A momentary silence followed. Then, the Dutchman speaks. "You have quite a reputation, Corporal van Rensburg. The Germans have a special name for you. Der Geist, the ghost. 10 confirmed kills of German officers in occupied Netherlands." "Enough talk," Holloway said. "Either open fire or leave us be." "No games, Lieutenant," Drexler replied, his voice suddenly hard. "Only a demonstration." There was a commotion in the underbrush. Then Lou's voice cried out in shock. Holloway's blood ran cold. "I believe this belongs to you," Drexler said, his voice moving to a clearing 20 yards ahead. The mist parted to reveal Drexler standing with Lou held firmly before him, a knife pressed to the young radio man's throat. Lou's eyes were wide with terror, but he managed to keep his composure. A trickle of blood ran from his temple where he'd been struck. "Lieutenant, I'm sorry," he called, voice remarkably steady despite the blade at his throat. "They came out of nowhere." "Quiet," Drexler ordered, pressing the knife slightly harder. "Now, Lieutenant Holloway, let's discuss terms. You and your remaining men surrender your weapons. In exchange, the boy lives." Holloway's mind raced through options. Dutch had disappeared into the forest, but even with his sharpshooting skills, a clean shot at Drexler was impossible while he used Lou as a shield. O'Reilly was in no condition to fight and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. "Don't do it, Lieutenant," Lou shouted. "He'll kill us all anyway." Drexler cuffed him sharply. "Your radio man has spirit, I'll give him that, but he lacks understanding of professional military honor." "Professional honor?" O'Reilly spat from behind a tree trunk. "Is that what you call holding a knife to a kid's throat?" "A necessary expedient," Drexler replied coldly. "This is war, Sergeant O'Reilly, not a sporting contest." Holloway studied the situation. Drexler stood at the edge of a small clearing, using Lou as a shield. Behind him were at least 3 other German soldiers, all that remained of his hunting party. Drexler himself looked somewhat worse for wear after his fall from the bridge. A makeshift bandage wrapped his left arm, and a deep gash marred his forehead. "You have 30 seconds to decide, Lieutenant," Drexler announced. "After that, I start by taking the boy's ear, then an eye. How much he suffers depends entirely on you." Holloway locked eyes with Lou. trying to convey reassurance. The young soldier gave an almost imperceptible nod. "All right," Holloway called, lowering his Thompson slightly. "No need for that. We surrender." "A wise choice," Drexler replied. "Now, weapons down and step into the clearing. Hands where I can see them." Holloway laid his Thompson on the ground and slowly stood, hands raised. O'Reilly, after a moment's hesitation, did the same with his pistol. "The Dutchman, too," Drexler demanded. "Call him back." "Dutch!" Holloway called. "It's over. Come on in." No response came from the forest. Drexler's expression darkened. "I won't ask again, Lieutenant. Either the Dutchman shows himself or the radio man bleeds." "He can't hear me," Holloway improvised. "He was circling to your rear, probably 100 yards out by now." Drexler studied him with narrowed eyes. "Very well, we move. Now, if your ghost reappears, wonderful. If not, 3 prisoners will suffice." He gestured to his men. "Secure them." 2 German soldiers approached cautiously, rifles trained on Holloway and O'Reilly. The third remained on guard, scanning the surrounding forest for Dutch. As the Germans moved to bind his hands, Holloway caught sight of Lou's face. Something had changed in the young soldier's expression, calculation replacing fear. Lou's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Drexler's sidearm, then back to Holloway. Understanding bloomed. Lou was planning something reckless. "Wait," Holloway said suddenly. "Before we do this, I want your word that my men will receive medical attention, especially O'Reilly. His wound is infected." The delay was minimal, but it allowed Holloway to shift his position slightly, coiling his muscles for what might come next. Drexler nodded dismissively. "As I said, you will be treated according to—" His words cut off as Lou suddenly drove, his elbow back into Drexler's ribs with all his strength. The German officer grunted in pain, his knife hand jerking away from Lou's throat. In that instant, Lou twisted violently, breaking Drexler's grip and lunging for the Luger holstered at his side. Chaos erupted. The German soldiers swung their rifles toward Lou but hesitated, afraid of hitting their commander. Holloway seized the moment, diving for his Thompson and rolling behind a tree as gunfire erupted. Lou and Drexler grappled for the Luger, falling to the ground in a desperate struggle. Despite Lou's youth, Drexler's combat experience showed. He delivered a vicious blow to Lou's wounded temple that sent the young soldier reeling. As Drexler raised the Luger to finish Lou, a single shot cracked from the forest edge. The German officer cried out, the pistol flying from his hand as blood blossomed from his wrist. Dutch had found his position. The German soldiers returned fire blindly while dragging their wounded commander toward cover. Holloway seized the opportunity, emptying his Thompson in a controlled burst that dropped one soldier immediately. The second dove behind a fallen log, returning fire. O'Reilly, despite his wound, had recovered his pistol and was providing covering fire. "Lou!" he shouted. "Get back here!" Lou scrambled toward them on hands and knees as bullets chewed the earth around him. He had almost reached the safety of the tree line when the third German soldier emerged, rifle aimed squarely at Lou's back. Dutch's second shot dropped the man before he could fire, but the final German soldier had worked his way around their flank. He rose suddenly behind O'Reilly, rifle butt swinging toward the wounded sergeant's head. O'Reilly sensed the movement and tried to turn, but his injured leg slowed him. The rifle butt connected with a sickening crack, sending him sprawling. The German swung his weapon toward Holloway, who had emptied his Thompson. For an instant, death seemed certain. Then Lou appeared from nowhere, launching himself at the German soldier with reckless abandon. Both went down in a tangle of limbs, the German's rifle discharging harmlessly. Holloway drew his pistol and rushed to help, but Lou had already rolled, clear, breathing hard. The German lay motionless, Lou's combat knife buried in his throat, a lesson learned from Dutch's silent killing technique. Lou stared at his handiwork with a mixture of horror and satisfaction. His hands trembled, but his eyes were clear. The idealistic boy had become a hardened soldier. "O'Reilly?" Holloway asked urgently. "Alive," Dutch confirmed, materializing from the forest. "Concussed, but he'll live." "And Drexler?" Dutch's expression was answer enough. "Gone. pulled back into the forest with one man supporting him. I had a fourth shot, but they vanished into heavy cover. Holloway cursed softly. Even wounded, and, with his force decimated, Drexler had managed to escape again. "He won't stop, will he?" Lou asked quietly, cleaning his knife on a handful of leaves. "No," Holloway replied. "Not until one of us is dead." Dutch quickly field-dressed Lou's head wound while Holloway checked on O'Reilly. The sergeant was already regaining consciousness, his eyes focusing slowly. "Did we get him?" O'Reilly mumbled. "Winged him," Holloway replied. "But he's still out there." O'Reilly struggled to sit up. "Then we finish this. Now, while he's wounded and down to one man." Holloway nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly. But we do it smart." He outlined his plan quickly. Drexler, wounded and, with dwindling resources, would be desperate now. He'd either retreat to find reinforcements or make one final push to complete his mission. Holloway was betting on the latter. Drexler's pride wouldn't allow him to return empty-handed. "He'll come for us again," Holloway predicted. "But this time, we choose the battlefield." A kilometer to the north lay an abandoned logging camp they'd passed the previous day, a collection of crude wooden buildings surrounding a central clearing. With proper preparation, it could become the perfect kill box. "Lou," Holloway said, "you did good back there. Real good. But the hardest part comes next." Lou's eyes, older now than they had been a week ago, met Holloway's steadily. "What do you need, Lieutenant?" "You're going to be bait," Holloway replied. "One more time." Lou moved alone through the forest, making no attempt to hide his trail. His footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. Broken branches marked his passage, and occasionally, he allowed drops of blood from his head wound to fall visibly on leaves. A perfect trail for a hunter to follow. Behind him, Holloway, Dutch, and O'Reilly had taken a circuitous route to the abandoned logging camp. By now, they would be establishing their final trap, a kill zone designed to end Drexler's hunt permanently. Lou's role was simple but dangerous. Lead Drexler directly into the ambush, timing his arrival precisely when the trap was ready. Too soon, and Drexler might detect the danger. Too late, and Lou himself could be caught in the lethal crossfire. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, but Lou found himself oddly calm. Days ago, he would have been terrified by such a mission. Now, having faced death at the end of Drexler's knife, having taken a life with his own hands, Lou discovered reserves of courage he hadn't known existed. He continued north, checking his wristwatch periodically to ensure his timing matched the plan. The logging camp was less than half a kilometer ahead now. Soon he would make the final approach, the most dangerous part of his journey. A twig snapped in the forest behind him. Lou froze, heart suddenly hammering. The sound had been deliberate, too loud, too obvious to be natural. Drexler was announcing his presence, playing mind games again. Following his instructions, Lou increased his pace slightly, moving with the appearance of growing anxiety. He let his footsteps become irregular, his path less certain, the behavior of someone who knows they're being hunted. Another sound followed. Pebble skittering across rock, close enough to maintain pressure, far enough to prevent Lou from determining exact distance or direction. Lou checked his watch again. 20 minutes until the designated time. The logging camp was just ahead, Hito could see the dark outline of its buildings through the trees. He needed to slow down, to give Holloway and the others time to complete their preparations. He deliberately stumbled, falling to one knee and making a show of examining his ankle, as if injured. The ploy would buy precious minutes while still maintaining the illusion that he was unaware of his pursuers. As he knelt, Lou caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows beneath the trees. Drexler was closer than he'd thought, and moving with greater stealth than expected for a wounded man. Lou felt cold fear slide down his spine. The plan required him to lead Drexler into the camp clearing at precisely the right moment. Too early, and the trap wouldn't be ready. Too late, and Drexler might grow suspicious of such convenient injury. He rose slowly, putting tentative weight on his injured ankle, then continued forward with a convincing limp. The logging camp loomed ahead, its weathered buildings standing like sentinels around the central clearing. According to Holloway's plan, Lou was to enter the clearing from the south, cross directly to the north side, and take cover in a predetermined location. Simple in theory, terrifying in execution. Lou reached the edge of the clearing and paused, making a show of scanning for danger before limping forward into the open space. The camp consisted of 5 crude buildings arranged around a central area once used for loading timber. Rotting logs and rusted equipment littered the ground. He was halfway across when Drexler's voice shattered the silence. "That's far enough, Private Becker." Lou froze, then turned slowly to face the German officer. Drexler stood at the clearing's edge, his wounded arm held stiffly at his side, his left hand aiming a Luger with practiced steadiness. Behind him, Feldwebel Kraus covered the approaches with his rifle. "I must commend Lieutenant Holloway on his use of you as bait," Drexler continued conversationally. "A classic tactic, well executed. The trail was almost too perfect." Lou said nothing, mind racing. Drexler had anticipated the trap, but had followed anyway. "Why?" "Your lieutenant is watching us now, I imagine," Drexler said, eyes scanning the surrounding buildings. "Along with your Dutch sniper and the wounded sergeant, a final ambush carefully prepared, and I, the predictable German, am supposed to walk right into it." He smiled thinly. "Very neat." Lou remained silent, acutely aware that any wrong word might reveal his comrades' positions. "The problem with such plans," Drexler continued, "is their predictability. Your lieutenant expects me to follow you into his carefully laid trap. Instead," he gestured to Kraus, who produced a small object from his pocket, a German stick grenade. "Instead, we create our own ending to this little drama," Drexler concluded. "Feldwebel?" Kraus pulled the grenade's cord and hurled it with practiced precision toward the largest building, the very location where Holloway had planned to spring their ambush. The grenade sailed through a broken window and detonated with a thunderous roar, sending fragments of wood and glass flying across the clearing. "Holloway!" Drexler shouted over the echoing explosion. "Enough games. Show yourself, or the next one kills your radio man." For several heartbeats, silence reigned. Then, from a direction neither Lou nor Drexler had anticipated, Lieutenant Jack Holloway stepped into view, not from the building Drexler had targeted, but from behind a stack of logs on the opposite side of the clearing. "Hello, Drexler," he said calmly, looking a little worse for wear. The German officer's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication of his surprise at Holloway's location. "The feeling is mutual, Lieutenant. Shall we end this?" "That's what I had in mind," Holloway replied, his gaze steady. In his right hand, partially concealed by his leg, he held something small and rectangular. A detonator. Drexler noticed it immediately. "A final trap, Lieutenant? More explosives under this clearing, perhaps?" "Something like that," Holloway acknowledged. "The question is, can you shoot both me and Lou before I press this trigger?" Drexler's expression remained impassive, but his mind was clearly racing through calculations. "An interesting dilemma," he conceded, "but incomplete. You've forgotten Feldwebel Kraus, who has his rifle trained on you this very moment." "I haven't forgotten him," Holloway said. "Dutch hasn't, either." As if summoned by his words, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the clearing. Feldwebel Kraus crumpled without a sound, a neat hole appearing in the center of his forehead. Dutch's third shot, precise, lethal, and perfectly timed. Drexler didn't flinch, didn't even look back at his fallen soldier. His Luger remained steadily, pointed at Lou's chest, his pale eyes locked with Holloway's. "And then there were 2, he observed quietly. "Just you and me," Holloway agreed. "As it should be." Lou stood frozen between them, acutely aware that his life hung in the balance of this final confrontation. Drexler could kill him instantly, while Holloway's detonator offered the only leverage keeping the German officer in check. "I underestimated you from the beginning," Drexler admitted, surprising both Americans with his frankness. "A costly error in judgment." "We both made mistakes," Holloway replied. "The difference is, mine didn't get my entire unit killed." A flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed Drexler's face. They were good men. They deserved a better fate than dying in these woods, hunting a handful of Americans. "War's full of undeserved fates," Holloway said. "So what happens now? Hauptmann, Mexican standoff until your reinforcements arrive?" Drexler's lips curved in a mirthless smile. "That would be the prudent course, yes. But I find myself disinclined toward prudence at this juncture." His finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the Luger's trigger. "Sometimes, Lieutenant, the game itself matters more than winning." Lou saw it then, the decision in Drexler's eyes. The German officer was going to shoot, consequences be damned. In that moment of clarity, Lou did the only thing he could think of. He dropped straight down, falling flat to the earth as Drexler's Luger barked. The bullet passed harmlessly overhead as Holloway pressed the detonator. The world exploded. The world exploded in a blinding flash as Lou's body hit the ground. The detonator in Holloway's hand had triggered O'Reilly's masterstroke, charges hidden in the surrounding tree line, positioned to spray deadly shrapnel inward. The perfect kill box. The first explosion was followed instantly by a second, then a third, creating overlapping waves of destruction. Fragments of metal and splintered wood scythed through the air. Men screamed. Bodies fell. Lou pressed himself flat against the earth as death whistled inches above him. Through the chaos, he glimpsed Drexler diving behind a rotting log, the German officer's instincts keeping him alive where his men perished. From his concealed position, O'Reilly watched his handiwork with grim satisfaction. Blood soaked through the fresh bandage on his leg, but he paid it no mind. There would be time for pain later, if they survived. Dutch's rifle cracked with methodical precision. One shot, one kill. The sharpshooter's training in the Dutch resistance had taught him economy of motion, of ammunition, of emotion. Any German who had survived the initial explosions found his escape cut short by Dutch's marksmanship. When the final charge detonated, buried beneath a pile of timber at the clearing's eastern edge, an unnatural silence descended, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the soft patter of debris raining down through the trees. Holloway rose from his position, Thompson at the ready. Smoke drifted across the clearing, partially obscuring his view, but he could make out at least 5 German bodies lying motionless amid the devastation. No sign of Drexler. Movement to his right caught Holloway's attention, a wounded German soldier crawling toward a discarded rifle. Holloway swung his Thompson around, but before he could fire, the man's head snapped back from the impact of Dutch's bullet. "Clear on the north side," came Dutch's voice through the smoke, calm and controlled. O'Reilly's voice followed, strained with pain but steady. "East side clear. I count 4 KIA." No response from Lou. Holloway's eyes swept the clearing, searching desperately for the young radio man. "Lou!" he called, forgetting caution in his concern. "Lou, report!" A weak cough answered from the center of the clearing. Lou was alive, still lying flat where he had fallen, blood seeping from a wound in his upper arm where Drexler's bullet had grazed him. "I'm okay, Lieutenant," he managed, his voice thin with shock. Just nicked me." Relief flooded through Holloway, but it was short-lived. As he moved toward Lou, instinct made him dive sideways just as a shot cracked from the far side of the clearing. The bullet meant for his head splintered bark from a log. Drexler. The German officer appeared through the smoke like a specter, his uniform torn and bloodied but his movements purposeful. His Luger was gripped in his left hand. His right, Holloway remembered, had been wounded by Dutch in their previous encounter. "It seems we've reached the endgame, Lieutenant," Drexler called, his cultured voice carrying clearly across the killing ground. "A masterful trap. My compliments." Holloway kept his Thompson trained on the German. It's over, Drexler. Your men are dead. Surrender, and I'll see you're treated according to the Geneva Convention. A thin smile curved Drexler's lips. So American, so optimistic. He gestured with his Luger. Do you really believe either of us is walking away from this? After what has transpired between us? The truth in Drexler's words struck Holloway like a physical blow. This had long since ceased to be about military objectives. This was personal, a blood vendetta born in the dark forests of the Ardennes, nurtured by loss and rage and the primal instinct to survive. In the periphery of his vision, Holloway could see Lou attempting to crawl toward cover. O'Reilly was working his way around the southern edge of the clearing, trying to flank Drexler. Dutch would be repositioning for a clear shot, if he had any ammunition left. Drexler noted these movements as well, his pale eyes missing nothing. Your men are resourceful, Lieutenant. A credit to your leadership. He shifted position slightly. But I'm afraid Corporal Van Rensburg has exhausted his ammunition. His last shot was most impressive, nearly 300 meters by my estimation. A shame he had only 4 rounds remaining. Holloway's blood ran cold. How could Drexler possibly know how many rounds Dutch had left? Unless... You've been watching us for days, Holloway realized aloud, even before the bridge. Of course, Drexler acknowledged with a slight nod. A hunter studies his prey, their habits, their weaknesses, their patterns. His voice hardened. Just as you studied me, Lieutenant. We are not so different, you and I. We're nothing alike, Holloway spat, though a part of him, the cold, calculating part that had sent Art Kowalski to his death, that had used Lou as bait, whispered otherwise. No? Drexler's eyes bored into Holloway's. We both sacrifice the lives of others to achieve our objectives. We both manipulate, deceive, kill without hesitation. The only real difference is the flag we salute. Holloway's finger tightened on the trigger of his Thompson, but he didn't fire. At this distance, with Drexler partially concealed, a burst from the submachine gun would likely miss, and he had only half a magazine left. Instead, he played for time, giving O'Reilly a chance to circle around. If that's true, why hunt us at all? Why not let us go, one professional respecting another? Because that is the nature of war, Lieutenant, Drexler replied, a note of genuine regret coloring his tone. We are but instruments of larger forces, playing our designated roles in a drama beyond our control. He adjusted his grip on the Luger, and now we must conclude our performance. Drexler's gaze flicked momentarily to the right, the only warning Holloway received before the German officer pivoted and fired twice in rapid succession. O'Reilly cried out, staggering backward as both rounds found their mark in his already wounded leg. The explosives expert collapsed against a tree trunk, his face contorted in pain. Holloway seized the opening, squeezing off a 3-round burst from his Thompson. But Drexler was already moving, rolling behind the cover of a massive oak as the bullets chewed bark where he had stood a heartbeat earlier. Your sergeant will bleed out in approximately 20 minutes without a tourniquet, Drexler called, his voice maddeningly calm. Dutch cannot help him without exposing himself. An interesting, tactical dilemma, wouldn't you agree? Rage boiled through Holloway's veins, not the hot, blinding anger of an amateur, but the cold, focused fury of a veteran soldier. Drexler was playing with them, turning their strengths against them, forcing them to make impossible choices. Just as Holloway had done to him with the bridge trap, with the false radio transmissions, with Lou as bait. Dutch, stay put, Holloway called out. O'Reilly, hang on! He needed to end this now before Drexler could pick them off one by one. Taking a deep breath, Holloway made his decision. He dropped the Thompson, too unwieldy for what he had in mind, and drew his combat knife. With deliberate movements, he stepped out from behind his cover, blade held low at his side. Just you and me, Drexler, he said, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Man to man, let's finish this. Drexler emerged from behind the oak, genuine surprise flickering across his aristocratic features. How unexpected, Lieutenant. and rather medieval. He gestured toward his Luger. "I still have this, you know." "Then use it," Holloway challenged, advancing slowly. "But we both know you won't. Not like this. Not at the end of our game." Something shifted in Drexler's pale eyes, a recognition, perhaps even respect. With a slight nod, he holstered his pistol and drew his own knife from his boot. The blade gleamed dully in the fading light, longer and more elegant than Holloway's utilitarian combat knife, but just as lethal. "You understand me better than I expected, Lieutenant," Drexler acknowledged. "Very well. As you Americans say, let's dance." They circled each other in the center of the devastated clearing, each man measuring the other with the calculating eyes of experienced killers. Drexler moved with the fluid grace of formal military training, his knife held in a traditional fencing grip despite his wounded right arm. Holloway's stance was more practical, forged in the brutal close-quarter combat of North Africa and Sicily. They closed simultaneously, blades flashing in deadly arcs. Drexler's first thrust was blindingly fast, aimed at Holloway's throat. Holloway parried and countered with a slash that caught only fabric as Drexler twisted away. They separated, reassessed, then engaged again. Blood bloomed on Holloway's shoulder as Drexler's blade found its mark. A heartbeat later, Drexler hissed, in pain as Holloway's knife sliced across his ribs. Neither wound was serious, but both men were now marked by the other. "You're quite good," Drexler observed, his breathing carefully controlled as they circled again. "But you lack formal training. Raw talent can only take you so far." "And you talk too much," Holloway retorted, launching a feint toward Drexler's wounded right side, then reversing direction to attack from the left. Drexler anticipated the move, sidestepping with balletic precision. His counterattack would have disemboweled Holloway had the American not thrown himself backward, landing hard, but intact. "Predictable," Drexler commented, pressing his advantage, as Holloway scrambled to his feet. "Your tactical thinking is admirable, Lieutenant, but in personal combat you telegraph your intentions." Holloway didn't waste breath responding. Instead, he changed tactics, abandoning finesse for brute force. He charged forward, absorbing a slash to his forearm in order to crash bodily into Drexler. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and knives, seeking vulnerable flesh as they rolled across the blood-soaked forest floor. Drexler's formal training worked against him in the chaotic grapple. His precise techniques required space and stance, neither of which existed in the desperate, intimate violence of ground fighting. Holloway, in contrast, had learned to brawl in the rough dockyards of Brooklyn long before he'd ever held a regulation knife. They separated again, both bleeding from multiple wounds, both gasping for breath. Drexler's uniform hung in tatters, his aristocratic composure finally cracking. Holloway's left eye was swelling shut from a vicious elbow strike, and his right leg trembled with fatigue. "It seemed we are evenly matched, after all," Drexler managed between breaths. "No," Holloway replied grimly. "We're not." Because Holloway had noticed what Drexler had missed. Lou, badly wounded but still conscious, had managed to drag himself to a fallen German soldier, had managed to claim the dead man's rifle, had managed to work the bolt, chamber around. And now, that rifle barrel was aimed squarely at Drexler's back. Holloway saw the exact moment Drexler realized something was wrong, the subtle shift in his gaze, the fractional widening of his eyes. The German officer began to turn, his remarkable instincts once again alerting him to danger. "Now, Lou," Holloway shouted. Lou's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked once, the sound deafening in the sudden silence. Drexler staggered, a look of almost comical surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the dark stain, blossoming on his chest. The knife fell from his nerveless fingers. He took a stumbling step toward Holloway, then another. "Well played," he whispered, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Well played indeed, Lieutenant." Then his legs gave way, and Hauptmann Erik Drexler collapsed at Holloway's feet, his pale eyes already glazing with death. But just before the light faded entirely, Drexler's lips curved in a final, enigmatic smile, as if, even in defeat, he had claimed some private victory, as if the game they had played had meanings and dimensions that Holloway had never grasped. Then he was gone. Holloway stood motionless, staring down at his fallen adversary, the knife still clutched in his bloodied hand. The silence stretched into infinity, broken only by the labored breathing of the survivors. "Lieutenant?" Lou's voice uncertain and very young. Is it over?" Holloway turned slowly, taking in the scene around him. The clearing had been transformed into a charnel house littered with German bodies and saturated with blood. O'Reilly was conscious but gray-faced, Dutch's belt serving as a makeshift tourniquet around his shattered leg. Dutch himself had materialized from the forest, his rifle slung uselessly across his back, its magazine empty as Drexler had claimed. Lou lay where he had fallen after firing his single shot, the rifle now discarded, his young face a mask of mingled shock, pain, and something deeper, the irreversible knowledge of having taken a human life. "Yes," Holloway said finally, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "It's over." As if to punctuate his words, the first golden rays of dawn broke through the eastern trees, illuminating the battlefield with harsh clarity. No shadows now, to hide the devastation, no darkness to soften the reality of what they had done and what had been done to them. Dutch helped O'Reilly to his feet, supporting the wounded sergeant as he hobbled toward Holloway. "We should move," Dutch said, quietly. "That last explosion will have been heard for kilometers." Holloway nodded, though the thought of further movement seemed almost impossible. His body was a catalog of pain, knife wounds, bruises, bone-deep exhaustion. But Dutch was right. Survival still dictated their actions, even in victory. He crossed, to where Lou still lay and knelt beside the young radio man. "Can you walk?" Lou nodded, though his face was pale beneath the streaks of dirt and blood. "Yes, sir, just give me a minute." "Good work, Lou," Holloway said, the words inadequate for what he truly meant, for what Lou had just experienced, for the life he had taken to save Holloway's. That was a hell of a shot. Lou didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on Drexler's body. "I killed him," he said finally, his voice strangely flat. "Just pulled the trigger and ended him. Just like that." "He would have killed us all," Holloway reminded him gently. "You did what you had to do." "I know." Lou looked up, his eyes older than they had been 5 days ago. "That's what scares me, how easy it was, how right it felt." Holloway had no answer for that. How could he explain to Lou that this was just the beginning, that the first kill was always remembered, but rarely the last, that war had a way of transforming men, of reshaping their souls until killing became as natural as breathing? Together they joined Dutch and O'Reilly at the edge of the clearing, the 4 survivors of what had begun as a simple reconnaissance mission, now bound by blood and sacrifice and shared nightmares. "Which way, Lieutenant?" O'Reilly asked, his voice tight with controlled pain. "Northwest," Holloway decided. "If we push hard, we might reach the 101st's lines by nightfall." They moved out slowly, their pace dictated by O'Reilly's wound and their collective exhaustion. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had survived. They had defeated Drexler and his hunting party against impossible odds. Yet as they limped away from the battlefield, Holloway couldn't escape the feeling that something essential had been lost in the process. Some fundamental human quality that separated them from men like Drexler, from the cold, calculating killers who viewed life as merely a piece to be sacrificed in a larger game. He glanced back once at the clearing, now receding behind them, at the body of Hauptmann Erik Drexler, lying where he had fallen, at the man who had hunted them relentlessly through the Ardennes, who had tested them, challenged them, forced them to become something other than what they had been, and Holloway wondered, in the secret chambers of his heart, if perhaps Drexler had won after all. The Germans had hunted them through the forest, unaware they were setting a trap, but by the time the trap was sprung, perhaps they had all become hunters. And perhaps they had all been hunted in turn, by fate, by circumstance, by the inexorable logic of war that transformed ordinary men into instruments of death. They would reach friendly lines. They would file reports. They would be commended for their actions behind enemy lines. Some might even call them heroes. But as they vanished into the depths of the forest, leaving behind the bodies of German soldiers and the ghost of Private Arthur Kowalski, Holloway knew the truth that no medal or commendation could ever acknowledge. They had survived, but at a cost none of them had fully understood when they'd first entered these woods. Because some traps, once sprung, can never truly be escaped. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.